Hello and welcome to Off My Shelves, and this is a look at The Last God, Book 1 of the Fellspyre Chronicles by Phillip Johnson and Riccardo Federici. That's a long title, let's get underway. So this is a standard size hardcover from a DC Comics. It's an amazingly well put together book, in fairness. Stunning production quality, even though it's the dreaded standard size. I know how everyone, including me, loves oversized, but for a standard sized hardcover, it is full colour. The paper inside is matte finish paper. It's got glued binding, but because of the way the book is made, the binding doesn't necessarily, hamper the reading experience too much. There's not much in the way of gutter loss at all. It's a really well put together book, to be fair. The dust jacket is insane. Under the dust jacket, you've got this almost canvasy finished type board. Yeah, lovely art on the back, and then on the front, the Last God and the title and everything. But the dust jacket really dives into the fantasy realms by printing a gigantic world map, and then plans of the main central cities and plans of the main buildings, the pinnacle and other things like that. The map of Cain and Nun, which is the world that The Last God is set in. And so the story of Last God is thoroughly a fantasy story. You may call it a dark fantasy because there is like ultra-violent moments in there, there is sex in there, so it is a grown-up fantasy, I suppose. But ultimately, it has got all of those fantasy tropes that you would expect to exist within a fantasy novel. It has got elves, it has got wizardry and magic and barbarians and everything going for it. It just calls all its characters by different names, so it feels a little fresh, weirdly, because it's got elven species in it, but they don't call them elves, they call them something else, and it's got all these familiar species, but they named slightly different, so they feel a bit fresher, really. So the book opens up with a quick flashback of 30 years prior to the modern day in the book kind of history and timeline, and it shows our main character, all hail King Tyr, the God Slayer, and it shows him slaying the last god. And then it fast forwards to the modern day where they are celebrating 30 years since the slaying of that last god. Essentially, the last god revolves around this original god being very bored and very empty, living in the void, in the darkness of existence. And so he creates other people, other gods, other races, other climates, and those gods in turn create other things as well. But then always the void, the darkness that he left behind is trying to claw him back, because he was left behind by this god, really. And so the void is constantly trying to come in and destroy what that god had created, and subsequently all the gods he created, what they created and all that. And obviously they created different species, elves, humans, all these types of offshoots, everything that you would expect from a fantasy book, to be fair. So the last god, 30 years prior to the modern day in the book, was trying to encroach and put a plague over the entire country that they called the Flowering Dead. And it turns everything into this very deadly kind of flower zombie-like existence. It's hard to explain, but it makes perfect sense in the book, to be fair. And anyway, the Flowering Dead is taking over the world 30 years ago, and so this group of heroes band together, all different species band together on a quest to bring down the last god. And 30 years on, they celebrating the god being vanquished back then. But it quickly transpires that the god in the void wasn't destroyed at all, that he's still alive and well, and is restarting his plan to use the Flowering Dead to dominate and destroy everything that the gods have created in the world of Canaan. And the king falls and the city falls, and you get introduced to one of our main characters, who is a slave, who in this story is a gladiator type slave, and he's undefeated and he's an amazing battler and all that type of thing. But obviously this gladiator gets kind of embroiled in the storyline because the city around him that he's performing in is getting destroyed, and the king is turning into a gigantic vine-like flower zombie ultimate being thing. I think that's the right terminology for it. But at the end of every issue you get that backstory, and these are fleshed out amazingly well. They've got various languages, they've got various songs, histories, and each extra at the end of each issue is not necessarily the same. Some are historians investigating hidden histories of the past, some are songs, some are personal journals. They're all very different, and they're all written differently to reflect that, and that's really good, I think, because they really open up and flesh out the world and the bits of the world that are not really featured in the graphic parts of these books at all. So by the end of the first issue, the city's destroyed and this cast of characters are now banded together. The Queen, this Gladiator, a few other characters are all lumped together to then go out and see if they can reclaim and stop the Flowering Dead and reclaim back their city. And so they go into various places that they hope will have the information for them. But what happens almost instantly as soon as issue 2 begins is the book starts telling you 2 stories simultaneously. So it starts telling you about the group that formed 30 years prior to take out the last god, but then it also follows the group that's formed right now in the modern day to do the same thing, to try and fight and defeat the last god. They're almost following in each other's footsteps. They take in the same paths, they're going along the same road because they head into a place called the Black Stay. And the Black Stay is this bridge almost between the real world and the void where the last god exists, really, and the only place they can actually access him and meet him to destroy him. But it's done really well, the jumping back and forth. They have little symbols and little notes to make sure that you know that this is the 30 years prior and this is the 30 years later. For me, I really enjoyed the structure of the story in issue 2 to issue 11, that jumping back and forth between the 2 time periods, because what you got is you got the story fleshed out and the world more than anything fleshed out, because certain things that the characters did 30 years prior directly affected how the world is for the 30 years later group. So they're experiencing a world that was massively affected by those guys earlier and that quest earlier, but you get to experience that kind of simultaneously, really. You see something and then you find out how that came to be, and then you jump forward to see how they go through that experience then. And yeah, and it does sound confusing when you explain it, but the way it layers the world and the way it jumps between those time periods were one of my favourite things about this book, I think. The world building in general is insane. The level of detail and the level of imagination in terms of the cultures and the world that it's built, the clothing, the architecture, the different cultures going on is astounding. The amount of work and love that's clearly gone into the world building of this. The characters themselves are one of the fatal flaws of this book, I think. It's because the characters are probably the least interesting thing about this book. The actual world that they're travelling through and the stories that they're picking up and the songs that they're hearing and the folklore that they're hearing, that's the interesting bit. The characters are very, I wouldn't say they're unlikable, but they're kind of a bit nothingy in a way. I couldn't really latch on to any of them and really enjoy them as a character and get behind them and like them. I was more enjoying them travelling through this world. And when those travels stopped, i.e. when they got to their destination at the end of the Black Stay and all that type of thing, that's when the book started to kind of get a bit meh for me, because I was enjoying the travelling and transversing around the world so much that when it stopped I was kind of like a bit disappointed. And the other thing I will say is the prose at the end of each issue are crazy good, but crazy frustrating as well. Frustrating because when you read them, you like, that visually would have made a better issue than the issue I just read. The backstory and the depth and the detail of some of the characters and some of the lore that this book shows in those prose bits really frustrated me, because I was like, I want to read that comic. I don't want to read this comic, I want to read that comic where it's telling you about how the gods formed different cultures and different societies, where it's telling you how a magician kind of went out and got dragon bones and dragon remains and turned them into different magical armaments and equipment. Honestly, they're insanely good, but I really, really like them, and I really, really hope that one day this creative team can get together and visualise some of the ancient lore and story of the world they've created here, because it sounds so good. That is not to belittle the story and the visual story that goes through the 12 issues, because it is really good. The artistry in particular is top drawer. My only issue is when the band of characters stop, the passion for my interest in the story stops, because I really loved investigating this world with these characters. When it's left with just them and the end guy to battle, it was just a bit okay. The travel in the world was where it was at for me, certainly. At the end of the book, you get loads more appendices and information and world building. You get a 13th chapter, which is by a different creative team and written after the end of this book, so I won't go into that. But either way, it is certainly well worth a read, and if you like fantasy books, I don't see really what's not to like about this, because if you like the genre of fantasy, then you're probably used to reading prose, and so that shouldn't put you off. But certainly if you read this book, do not avoid the prose sections at the end. They are really what bring this world to life, and then the next issue you read after, you will enjoy it all the more for having that information, I think. But yeah, thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you on the next one.